The scream of metal ripped through the night, followed by the sharp clang of steel on steel. Inside North Shore Marine Works, the night shift froze as sparks rained from the cutting torches, glowing like tiny meteors before fading into the oily air. It was a cold Halifax night, the kind that crept through the seams of every wall and settled deep in the bones. Then came the crash. A single echoing sound of boots slipping on metal, the clatter of a clipboard, and a woman's short cry cut off too soon. When the workers turned toward the noise, they saw her. Clara Jennings, the company's CEO, lay crumpled at the bottom of the staircase, one stiletto heel still lodged halfway up the steps, her head resting at an unnatural angle. For a long moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. From across the floor, a man was already running. Malcolm Reed, night security, 30 pounds of muscle and memory wrapped in a faded blue uniform, sprinted through the smell of diesel and heat. He dropped to his knees beside her, unzipping his heavy navy coat, the same one he'd worn when he served on patrol ships years ago, and pressed it gently against the wound above her eyebrow. "Stay with me," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. Around them, workers stood still, half hidden in shadow, unsure whether to help or to keep their heads down. The unspoken lines were clear. The CEO on the floor, the black guard kneeling beside her. Power didn't bend like that in this place. Malcolm glanced up, voice steady. "Call 911. No one moved." Someone muttered, "We should wait for management." Malcolm's stare was sharp enough to slice through the fog. "Then you'll be waiting alone." He grabbed the radio from his belt, reported the fall, and spoke into the static until he heard a voice confirm the ambulance was on its way. Clara tried to move, groaning as she lifted her head. "Don't," he said softly. "You hit hard. Stay still." Her lips trembled, and for a second she found his hand and held it. "Don't. Leave me," she whispered. "I won't," he said, pressing his coat tighter against her wound. The sirens came faintly through the rain. By the time paramedics burst through the factory doors, she was slipping in and out of consciousness. They pushed Malcolm aside, but her fingers clung to his wrist until they had to pry them away. Then they lifted her onto the stretcher, their boots echoing down the corridor, and the crowd began to move again, as if nothing had happened. The machines whirred back to life. The night shift carried on. The jacket he'd used to stop her bleeding lay in a heap against the wall, stained dark and heavy. At dawn, the company email arrived. A minor workplace incident. A precautionary hospital stay. Business as usual. No mention of the oil leak that had been reported 3 times. No mention of the ignored safety forms sitting unsigned in Peter Lang's office. Malcolm read the message on the bulletin board, his face unreadable. Someone beside him muttered, "Guess she'll think twice before walking the floor again." He said nothing, just turned and walked out into the freezing air. The harbor wind hit him as he crossed the parking lot. He could still smell the iron and blood on his hands. His apartment above the laundromat was dark when he unlocked the door. A small voice came from the kitchen. "Dad?" His son, Noah, stood on a stool, spreading peanut butter on toast with more care than most grown men gave their jobs. His school clothes were clean, but a little too small. "You didn't come home," the boy said quietly. Malcolm exhaled. There was an accident at work. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said. "Just tired." Noah studied him. "You helped someone again, didn't you?" Malcolm smiled faintly. "Something like that." He sat at the table while the boy poured him coffee from a chipped mug. The walls hummed with the sound of pipes, the faint rhythm of laundry machines below. Outside, a ship's horn bellowed across the fog. On the counter sat a small model ship Noah had been building from popsicle sticks, half-painted blue, the name North Shore, written crookedly in pencil. "Mom used to like the sea," the boy said. Malcolm's voice was quiet. "She did." For a long moment, they said nothing, just listened to the rain hitting the glass. Later that morning, Malcolm walked back through the factory gates. Workers avoided his eyes. The floor had been cleaned, the staircase polished, the smell of bleach thick enough to sting. The place where she'd fallen was spotless now, like it had never happened. But in his mind, he could still see the moment, her eyes wide with fear, her hand gripping his. "Don't leave me." Maybe she hadn't meant it literally. Maybe it was something else. A plea against all the silence that followed. He looked up toward the gray rafters, the fogged windows, the blinking lights that never stopped humming. Somewhere beneath all that noise was the truth. Hidden, ignored, waiting. He adjusted his cap and turned toward the harbor, where the wind carried the faint sound of sirens echoing off the water. He didn't know it yet, but that one act, the decision to move when everyone else froze, was about to change everything. In the days to come, questions would rise, walls would crack, and the quiet man who had spent his life guarding other people's property would learn how to guard something far more fragile, justice itself. But for now, as the sun fought through the clouds over Halifax, Malcolm Reed simply walked home, unaware that the story of a lifetime had already begun. Stay with this story, because sometimes the smallest act of courage in the darkest hour can light a fire that changes everything. The sound of rain tapping against glass was the first thing Clara Jennings heard when she opened her eyes. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and salt. Outside the skyline of Halifax was a gray smear of cranes and cold light. Her head throbbed, a dull rhythm behind her temple where the bandage pressed tight. When she tried to move, pain cut through her shoulder like a wire pulled too hard. "Easy," a nurse said gently. "You took quite a fall." Clara blinked, disoriented. Memories flickered in fragments. The stairs, the oil, the sudden drop. And then him. The security guard with the calm voice and steady hands. She remembered the warmth of his jacket, the weight of it against her skin, and the way he didn't hesitate when everyone else did. On the bedside table sat a tablet, screen glowing softly. Someone had sent her a report from the factory. Incident video. The subject line read. She hesitated, then tapped play. The grainy footage showed the staircase, the flash of her fall, the frozen workers watching from their stations. Seconds stretched before anyone moved. Then, in the corner of the frame, a blur of motion, Malcolm Reed running toward her, coat in hand. He was the only one. She watched the moment again, slower this time, and felt her stomach tighten. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, Megan, stepped in, clutching a tablet and a nervous smile. "You're awake, thank God." "What's the damage?" Claire asked. "Concussion, 2 cracked ribs. They say you're lucky." Megan hesitated before continuing. "PR already drafted a statement, just a workplace accident. We'll handle the press, but Legal's worried," Clara finished. "Yes, about liability, about optics." Clara's gaze sharpened. "Optics?" Megan nodded reluctantly. "You were helped by one of the security staff. Night shift. They're concerned about how it might look if you talk to him, or thank him publicly. It could create complications." Clara let out a dry laugh that made her wince. "Complications? He saved my life." "I know. But HR's already spoken to him. They asked him not to discuss the incident. It's standard protocol." "Find him," Clara said quietly. "I want to see him." "Clara, I said find him." Across town, Malcolm Reed sat in the small HR office, his broad shoulders barely fitting the plastic chair. The fluorescent light hummed above, flickering slightly. Across from him sat a young woman in a navy blazer, her tone polite but rehearsed. "We just want to express the company's appreciation," she said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "Your quick response reflected well on North Shore Marine Works. The leadership team is very grateful." Malcolm didn't touch it. "What's this?" "A token of thanks, and a reminder to avoid discussing the incident outside official channels. You understand? It's sensitive." He picked up the envelope, opened it, saw the check inside, and set it back down. "If this is thanks, you can keep it." "Mr. Reed, we're just trying to—" "I didn't do it for money," he said quietly. "I did it because someone was bleeding on the floor." The HR rep cleared her throat, uncomfortable. "Still, it would be best if you didn't—" "Don't worry," Malcolm said, standing. I don't talk much anyway." He walked out into the drizzle, hands shoved into his pockets, the envelope still lying untouched on the desk behind him. By evening, Clara's assistant had arranged it. The meeting was off the record. No press, no photos, no company email. Just 5 minutes, as she'd insisted. When Malcolm arrived at the hospital, he looked like a man out of place. Worn jacket, calloused hands, the faint smell of rain clinging to him. Clara was sitting upright, a thin blanket around her shoulders, watching the city lights shimmer across the harbor through the window. "Come in," she said softly. He hesitated by the door. "Ma'am, they said—" "I know what they said. Sit, please." He sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes lowered. "I wanted to thank you," she began. "They told me you were the one who just did what anyone would do." Clara tilted her head. But no one else did. Silence settled between them. The rain outside softened against the glass. Finally, she asked, "Why? Why did you help me?" He looked up, his eyes dark but steady. "Because my son's watching me grow up. And I want him to know that doing the right thing doesn't depend on who's bleeding." For a long moment, she said nothing. The answer caught her off guard. Not rehearsed, not humble, just true. She looked at his hands. Rough, scarred, honest, and realized she'd never really seen hands like that except from the window of her office, where workers moved like distant dots. "What's his name?" she asked quietly. "Noah." "Does he know what you did?" "He knows I came home late," Malcolm said. "That's enough." She nodded slowly, thoughtful. For the first time in her career, she felt the sharp edge of the divide between the people who built her company and those who owned it. The space between them wasn't just about money. It was about visibility, who got seen, and who didn't. When the nurse entered to check her vitals, Malcolm rose to leave. "I should go," he said. "Will you come back?" she asked without thinking. He paused at the door. "If you need someone to stand guard, you already have plenty of people for that. But if you need someone to tell you the truth, I guess you know where to find me." The door closed softly behind him. Clara stared at the space he'd left, her reflection in the window merging with the rain-slick harbor lights below. For the first time since her fall, the silence around her didn't feel empty. It felt heavy, full of questions she could no longer ignore. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the night guard walked home through the mist, his breath fogging the air, unaware that his quiet honesty had just cracked the armor of an empire built on silence. By the end of that week, Clara Jennings was back on her feet. The doctors had urged rest, but rest had never suited her. The fall had left a thin scar just above her eyebrow, a faint reminder of how fragile even power could be. At dawn, a driver waited outside her townhouse, ready to take her to the office as usual. She waved him off. "Not today," she said, pulling on a gray jacket and a pair of worn boots that hadn't seen daylight since her university years. She drove herself to North Shore Marine Works, the windshield streaked with drizzle, the city still waking under a low Atlantic sky. When she pulled into the parking lot, the guard at the gate blinked in surprise. Executives didn't come here without notice. She signed her own name on the visitor sheet, clipped the badge to her collar, and walked through the factory doors alone. The air hit her like a living thing. Metal, oil, heat, sweat, and salt. For the first time in her career, Clara wasn't looking down at the plant from a glass office. She was inside it. Men and women glanced up from their stations, cautious. Some nodded stiffly, others avoided her eyes. Word of the accident had traveled fast, but the sight of their CEO limping down the main aisle by herself was something else entirely. She stopped by a welding bay where sparks burst in rhythmic flashes. "Who maintains these torches?" she asked. A welder wiped his hands on his apron. "Maintenance logs it, ma'am." "And when's the last inspection?" He hesitated. "Couldn't say. Maybe a few months." Clara frowned. "Where are the logs kept?" "Office 2 by the back," he said, and went back to work. The deeper she walked, the more she saw. The taped-over leaks, the burnt-out bulbs that hadn't been replaced, the safety posters curling on the walls. A clipboard left on a bench caught her eye. Complaint form, slip hazard, stairwell 3. The same area where she'd fallen. The form was unsigned, the status box marked pending. Clara flipped through the pages. There were dozens more. Injuries, warnings, near misses, all marked the same way. Pending. Forgotten. That afternoon, she found herself standing by the old guard booth, hesitating before knocking. Inside, Malcolm was checking the monitors, his reflection flickering in the black and white screens. When he saw her, he stood quickly. "Ma'am." "I told you to call me Clara," she said, stepping inside. He nodded, but didn't answer. The booth smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked paper. "I need your help," she said, lowering her voice. "Off the record." He arched a brow. "With what?" "Maintenance logs, work orders, anything that might explain what's been happening in that plant." "That's a big ask." "I know, but I can't fix what I don't understand." Malcolm studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're not supposed to have access. I'm not asking for permission." Something in her tone, steady, unapologetic, made him reconsider. He turned to the console, typing in a few commands. The screen blinked to life with lines of coded entries, dates, initials, repair notes. He printed them one by one, the old machine spitting out paper like breath. When the printer jammed, he smacked it lightly. "They cut the budget for this thing 2 years ago," he muttered. "That seems to be a theme around here," Clara said quietly. Together, they pored over the records. The more they read, the more the pattern emerged. Requests marked as completed when no parts had been ordered. Repairs signed off by supervisors who hadn't been on shift. Then Malcolm pointed at one line near the bottom of the page. "There, that signature. Peter Lang." Clara froze. Lang was the director of operations, one of her father's oldest hires. He signed off on the safety compliance last quarter. "Except look here," Malcolm said. "He approved an inspection on a day he was in Toronto. I checked the schedule. He wasn't even in the province." Clara stared at the document, the ink smudged from someone's careless hand. "So the reports are forged." "Looks that way." Outside, a forklift beeped as it reversed, its lights flashing through the booth window. The hum of machinery seemed suddenly louder, like a warning. Clara leaned against the counter. "How deep do you think this goes?" Malcolm shook his head. "Deep enough that people stopped noticing the rot." She looked at him then, really looked, at the calm in his voice, the weariness in his eyes. Why didn't anyone say anything? He gave a half-smile without humor. People did. The question is, who listened? The printer whirred again, spitting out another sheet. She caught it before it hit the floor. Across the top, stamped in faded red ink, were the words, "Closed file. Do not reopen." Clara exhaled. Someone's been burying this for years. Malcolm nodded. Welcome to the basement of the Empire. Over the next few days, they met quietly, sometimes in the security office after midnight, sometimes by the vending machines where cameras didn't reach. She'd bring coffee, he'd bring data. The unlikely pair, one born into legacy, the other into labor, found a rhythm built on respect and shared disgust for the lies in front of them. There were moments when the air between them grew heavy with something unspoken, not romance, not yet, but understanding. A recognition that both had spent years surrounded by people who spoke at them, not with them. Once, as they stood in the dim light of the stairwell where she'd fallen, Clara said softly, "When I was a kid, my father used to bring me here. He said this place was built on loyalty." Malcolm looked at the rust creeping along the rails. Loyalty's a word people use when they mean obedience. She smiled, faintly, almost sadly. "Maybe it's time we redefine it." He didn't answer, just handed her another file, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. By the time Clara drove home that night, her mind was a blur of dates and signatures. But beneath the paperwork, something deeper had started to shift. The faint, dangerous sense that truth wasn't just hidden under the steel and oil. It was buried under generations of silence, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to dig it up. And, maybe for the first time, she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. The envelope came with no return address. It was slipped under the door of the security booth sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, when the plant was at its quietest and even the machines seemed to breathe in their sleep. Malcolm found it at dawn. The paper was damp from fog, the handwriting jagged like it had been carved instead of written. He unfolded it slowly, the words scrawled across the page in thick black ink. "Watch your step. Nobody wants you saving the world." He read it twice, then a third time, and placed it back on the counter. No signature, no logo, just the truth disguised as a threat. The morning light pushed through the blinds, striping his face with gray. He stared at the note a long while, then tore it cleanly in half and dropped it in the trash. He'd seen worse. Threats, warnings, intimidation. But that was before he had a son watching every move he made. When Malcolm stepped outside after his shift, the air was wet and cold, carrying the smell of sea salt and iron. He reached his car and stopped. One of the rear tires sagged flat against the asphalt, slid open cleanly across the sidewall. Noah's lunchbox sat in the passenger seat, still packed from the night before. The boy had forgotten it again. Malcolm crouched down, fingers brushing the rubber's edge. It wasn't vandalism, it was precision. Someone wanted him to know they could get close. By the time he got home, the sky had turned the color of tin. Noah was sitting at the kitchen table, sketching a robot on lined paper. He looked up, eyes wide. "Dad, why are you late?" "Flat tire," Malcolm said, hanging his jacket. "Someone thought I needed a little more exercise." The boy frowned. "Did you make someone mad?" Malcolm smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You'd be surprised how easy that is when you tell the truth." Noah didn't laugh. "Are you in trouble?" He knelt beside him. "Not the kind you need to worry about." But the boy's silence lingered. The pencil stopped scratching the page. Malcolm ruffled his hair and changed the subject, but the unease hung there, heavier than the storm clouds outside. Across town, Clara Jennings was sitting in her father's old study. The room still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and oak polish, even though he'd been retired for years. Richard Jennings was once the kind of man whose handshake could close deals faster than contracts. He was older now, slower, but the steel in his voice hadn't dulled. "I hear you've been walking the factory floor," he said without looking up from his newspaper. "Interesting choice for a CEO." "Someone has to," Clara replied. He folded the paper neatly, setting it aside. "Clara, the board is already restless. You dig too deep, you'll find things that can't be fixed, and people who won't forgive you for trying. I'm not afraid of them. You should be. The system you're poking at," he gestured vaguely, "it's the same one that paid for your education, for this house, for the roof over your son's head someday, if you're smart enough to have one." Clara leaned forward. "That system nearly killed me." Her father's eyes softened for the briefest moment. "Then get out of its way. Don't destroy the thing that feeds you, Clara. You don't win by burning the table. You win by keeping your seat." She stood, voice shaking with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Maybe it's time to build a new table." That night, the harbor was a sheet of black glass. The wind carried the faint clang of rigging from distant ships, the city's light stretching across the water in trembling reflections. Malcolm stood on the old pier, hands buried in his coat pockets, watching the fog roll in from the Atlantic. The note's words kept echoing in his head. "Nobody wants you saving the world." He heard footsteps before he saw her. Clara's heels clicked softly against the wooden planks until she stopped beside him. She was dressed simply, dark coat, scarf wrapped against the wind, but the exhaustion in her face said more than any headline could. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "Neither was I." They stood in silence, the only sound the soft slap of waves beneath them. "They're scared of you," Malcolm said finally. "Of me?" Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm the one they built. I'm their proof that the system works, until I stopped pretending it did." He turned toward her, the harbor lights flickering across his face. "You get a warning yet?" She hesitated. "Not in writing." Just a few calls. A few old friends reminding me of everything I'm risking. He nodded. Then it started. Clara's gaze drifted out toward the water. My father told me not to fight it. Said I shouldn't burn the table that fed me. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Funny thing about tables, the people sitting at the top always forget who built the damn legs. The wind picked up, scattering drops of salt spray against their coats. For a long time, neither spoke. The distance between them felt both fragile and familiar, like they'd met in another life and were finishing a conversation left unfinished. Finally, Clara broke the silence. Do you ever wonder if we're making it worse? If digging this up just puts more people in danger? Malcolm shook his head. No. I've seen what happens when good people stay quiet. He looked out over the water, voice low but certain. Silence doesn't keep us safe, Clara. It just keeps everything wrong alive. The words hung between them, sharp and heavy as the wind. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the truth of it settle. Behind them, the city lights flickered like tired stars. Ahead, the open water stretched into darkness. For the first time, they both understood what they were up against. Not just corruption or politics, but the long shadow of fear that made everyone complicit. And yet, standing there beneath the cold Atlantic night, they also understood something else. Neither of them was going to walk away. Rain tapped against the corrugated roof of the maintenance shed, soft and rhythmic like a pulse. The air smelled of metal dust and damp concrete. It was nearly midnight when Clara arrived, her coat pulled tight against the cold. Inside, Malcolm and Sophia Tran were waiting. Sophia, the plant's systems engineer, looked up from the computer balanced on a crate. Her glasses fogged in the chill, and the glow of the monitor cast pale light across her determined face. You're late, Sophia said, not unkindly. Traffic, Clara replied, and paranoia. She glanced toward the door. Anyone see you come in? Malcolm shook his head. Only ghosts. On the screen was a folder, its name simple and unassuming. Vault. Sophia tapped the keyboard. Encrypted double layer. If anyone tries to open it without the password, it wipes itself clean. No recovery. And the password? Clara asked. Malcolm's deep voice filled the space. Justice. Sophia arched a brow. Little on the nose, don't you think? Sometimes the truth doesn't need to hide, he said. Clara smiled faintly, though there was nothing light in her eyes. The past few weeks had turned her into someone both sharper and quieter, the kind of person who watched before speaking. Okay, Sophia said, rubbing her hands together. What do we have? Malcolm opened a folder on the desk. Photocopies, handwritten notes, screenshots from internal logs. Start here, he said. Testimonies, photos of damaged machinery, names of people who filed complaints and got fired for it. Clara pulled out a chair. We'll need dates, statements, audio. It's not just about what they did. It's about the pattern. Sophia nodded. So, a story told in evidence. Exactly, Clara said. They began with Raymond Ellis, a welder who'd lost 2 fingers when a pressure valve malfunctioned. He met them in the back of a shuttered diner, his hands hidden in fingerless gloves. They said it was my fault, he muttered, eyes fixed on his coffee. Said I wasn't paying attention. Malcolm placed a small recorder on the table. What really happened? The valve was overdue for inspection. I filed 3 requests. Never heard back. The supervisor told me to keep quiet if I wanted overtime. Clara leaned forward. Do you have proof? Raymond looked at her, skeptical, beaten down, but not broken. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. Copy of the work order, my signature, their stamp. When he left, Sophia slipped the recording into a folder. That's one. One of many, Clara said. Next came Marie Dufour, a machine operator laid off after reporting chemical fumes near her station. She spoke in French-accented English, her voice thin but defiant. They told me to sign a non-disclosure if I wanted severance. I didn't. Her story mirrored dozens of others. Each testimony was a piece of a puzzle too big to fit on one screen. For weeks, they worked like shadows, meeting in empty offices, parking lots, the back of Malcolm's car. The vault grew heavier with every file. Images of burns, x-rays, payroll slips, dismissal letters, transcripts of phone calls where managers silenced complaints. One night, while Sophia uploaded data, the hum of her laptop fan filled the silence. "You realize," she said, "if they catch us, we're all out of a job." Malcolm leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "If we don't do this, someone else might be out of a life." Clara looked up from her notes. "That's the point." At home, Malcolm tried to keep the weight from bleeding into his evenings. Noah was at the kitchen table, scissors and old paper spread around him. "Homework?" Malcolm asked. "Art project," Noah said. "We're supposed to make something that floats." He folded a square of paper in half, creasing the edges carefully. "You know," he said, "if you fold it just right, it can hold its shape, even in deep water." Malcolm watched as his son lifted the tiny paper boat, its corners neat and proud. "You think it'll float?" Malcolm asked. Noah smiled. "It has to. I made it right." Malcolm sat beside him, taking another piece of paper. His big hands moved clumsily, but with care. "Show me again," he said. Noah laughed as his father fumbled through the folds. "You can't rush it, Dad. If you crease too hard, it sinks." When they finished, two small boats sat on the table side by side. Noah filled a bowl with water and gently set his down. It bobbed, wobbled, but stayed afloat. "See," he said proudly, "it's not about being perfect. It's about balance." Malcolm nodded, a quiet smile crossing his face. "Balance," he repeated softly. He watched the paper boat glide across the surface. Light, fragile, but refusing to drown. Later, after Noah went to bed, he looked at the boats again, floating in the dim light from the stove. Truth, he thought, was like that, delicate but stubborn. No matter how deep the water, it always found a way to stay above it. By the end of the month, the vault had grown into something alive, a digital heartbeat of every hidden wound inside. North Shore Marine Works. The three of them, Malcolm, Clara, Sophia, sat together in the shed one final night, the cold creeping in from the door. Sophia closed her laptop and exhaled. "It's all there. Testimonies, documents, timestamps, photos, everything we've found." Clara rubbed her temples. "Now we just have to figure out what to do with it." Malcolm looked from one woman to the other. "We wait. We listen. When the time's right, we use it." Sophia nodded. "Until then." "Until then," he said, "we keep building the truth." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn echoed across the harbor. The sound rolled through the night like a promise. Lonely but steady, three strangers who'd once stood on opposite sides of a system now shared a secret heavier than any of them had ever carried. But in that weight, something unexpected had formed. Trust. And trust, they all knew, was the one thing their enemies could never fake. The first snow of early winter drifted across the Halifax harbor, settling like ash over the cranes and smokestacks. Inside North Shore Marine Works, the air felt heavier than the weather outside. Meetings whispered behind closed doors. Smiles were thinner, greetings shorter. Something was moving beneath the surface, something that everyone could feel, but no one dared name. Clara Jennings stood at the head of the boardroom table, a stack of folders under her arm. "We're launching a full internal audit," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Every department, every contract, every safety log." A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. Peter Lang, head of operations, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "An audit? You're aware that will disrupt production," he said, "and it'll cost us." "Then we'll pay for the truth," Claire replied. Lang's smile vanished. "The truth is, this plant runs because people like me keep it running. You want to tear down the system? Be my guest, but don't expect it to thank you when the paychecks stop clearing." "I'm not tearing anything down," Clara said evenly. "I'm cleaning it." That was the moment Peter decided to fight back. 2 days later, Malcolm arrived for his shift, only to find a man from HR waiting near his booth. The man carried a clipboard and a rehearsed expression. "Malcolm Davis." "That's me." You've been cited for breaching security protocol, unauthorized access to restricted files." Malcolm frowned. "What files?" "Maintenance logs." The man said, his tone carefully neutral. "You accessed them without clearance." Malcolm understood immediately. Someone had planted the trail. "Who filed this complaint?" "It's confidential," the man replied. "Effective immediately. You're suspended pending investigation." He handed Malcolm a sealed envelope. The words, "Administrative leave," printed in bold letters at the top, felt like a punch. Around them, a few workers slowed their steps, pretending not to watch. Malcolm didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any protest. He simply nodded once, handed over his badge, and walked out into the falling snow. By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire. Some said he'd hacked company data. Others whispered he was stealing. A few still defended him, but most stayed quiet. Fear was contagious, and no one wanted to catch it. In the lunchroom, Sophia slammed her tray down, furious. "They're setting him up, Clara. You know it." "I know," Clara said, her voice tight. "Peter's behind it. He's trying to make an example." "Then stop him." "I can't. Not yet. If I move too soon, they'll bury everything we've built." Sophia stared at her. "They already are." Clara looked out the window, watching snow swirl past the factory's tall gray walls. Her reflection stared back, small against the glass. "Not for long," she said softly. Malcolm spent the next few days at home, fixing what didn't need fixing, tightening screws, oiling hinges, rearranging shelves, anything to keep his hands busy. But stillness had a way of finding him. On Sunday, he took Noah to church. The small brick building smelled of cedar and candle wax. Inside, familiar faces turned toward him with quiet sympathy. Some nodded, others avoided his eyes. After the service, Pastor Marcus Hall, an old friend of Malcolm's late father, approached him at the back pew. The man was tall, with silver in his beard and warmth in his voice. "I heard," Marcus said gently. "You doing all right?" Malcolm managed to smile. "I've been better." Marcus sat beside him. "They can take your job, Malcolm, but not your truth." "Truth doesn't pay the bills, Pastor." "No, but lies cost more than you can afford." Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head. "I keep thinking about the others. The people still in there. They're scared." Marcus nodded. "So shine light, not fire. Don't fight darkness by burning it. Just let it see itself. That's how you win." Malcolm stared at the stained glass window above the altar. Sunlight fractured through blue and red shards, spilling over the pews like liquid color. "Shine light," he murmured. "Exactly," Marcus said, rising. "You don't need to destroy the house. Just open the windows." That same evening, Clara stood in her apartment surrounded by files. Papers covered the dining table, the floor, even the counter by the coffee pot. Her father's words echoed in her head. "Don't destroy the table that feeds you." But she knew now the table had been built on bones. Her phone buzzed. A message from Sophia. "Peter's calling emergency meeting tomorrow. Rumor, they're pushing for your resignation." Clara exhaled slowly, steadied herself, and typed back, "Then it's time to go higher." She picked up a folder marked Vault Summary, flipped through the pages of names, injuries, signatures, and timestamps, every piece of truth they'd gathered. An hour later, she walked through the freezing air toward a nondescript government building downtown. Inside, a clerk led her to a conference room where two investigators from the Department of Labor Canada waited. Clara introduced herself, then slid the folder across the table. "What I'm giving you isn't rumor or speculation. It's documentation. Years of safety violations, falsified reports, retaliation against whistleblowers. I want a formal investigation into North Shore Marine Works." The older investigator glanced through the pages, his brow tightening. "You understand this could trigger a full federal audit?" "I do." "And you'll be under scrutiny as well." "I expect to be." For a moment, silence filled the room, thick but clean, the kind that comes before truth replaces noise. Finally, the investigator nodded. "We'll review this immediately." Clara stood, her voice steady. Do that. And, please, protect the people who trusted me enough to talk." Outside, the snow had turned to rain, thin and cold. She walked to her car, the city lights blurring in the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, the hour maybe, or a ship leaving harbor. As she started the engine, her phone buzzed again. A message from Malcolm. "Heard you stood up for the truth. I'll be ready when they come for us next." Clara smiled faintly. "They already did," she typed back. "We're still standing." And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone in the fight. The storm had broken open, and through the cracks, the light was starting to pour in. The story broke on a gray Wednesday morning. Halifax woke to headlines that cut sharper than any winter wind. The night guard and the truth buried beneath steel blazed across the front page of the Halifax Chronicle, printed in bold black ink that bled just enough to feel alive. The article began with a single photograph. Malcolm Davis standing in the snow outside the factory gates, his face half shadowed by the security booth light. Beneath it, the caption read, "He saw what no one wanted to see and refused to stay quiet." Inside, journalist Elena Fraser told everything: the forged safety reports, the intimidation, the silence that had become policy. She didn't name all her sources, but the evidence was too precise to ignore. The story painted a picture not of a scandal, but of a slow rot, a system that traded dignity for efficiency. By noon, the phones at North Shore Marine Works wouldn't stop ringing. News crews gathered at the gates. Workers huddled in the cafeteria, reading the article aloud like scripture. "Did you see this?" one asked, showing a printout to another. They mentioned the audit, and Malcolm, and Clara. In living rooms across Nova Scotia, people who had never stepped foot in a factory shared the story online with hashtags like "Ishaker Steel Truth" and "Stand with Malcolm." And by evening, the Canadian Department of Labor issued a formal statement. An external inquiry into North Shore Marine Works has been initiated. All parties are expected to cooperate fully. The storm had broken wide open. In his small apartment overlooking the harbor, Malcolm sat with Noah at the kitchen table. The Chronicle lay open between them. The boy's eyes darted from the picture to his father's face. "That's you," Noah said softly. Malcolm nodded. "Yeah. You're on the news. Seems that way. Does it mean you're in trouble?" Malcolm hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Maybe. But sometimes trouble's the only way to get to the truth." Noah reached out and touched the paper, his small hand resting on the image. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Malcolm felt his throat tighten. "Thanks, kiddo." The clock ticked quietly. Outside, the harbor lights flickered against the dark water. For the first time in months, Malcolm didn't feel like a man trapped between walls. He felt seen. At the factory, chaos brewed. Executives stormed in and out of offices. Phones rang. Emails pinged. Lawyers barked orders. But Peter Lang stayed calm. Or pretended to. He paced his office, blinds drawn, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. In front of him, an external hard drive was nearly full. Years of documents, some falsified, others conveniently edited, ready to vanish with a single keystroke. He wiped the sweat from his brow, muttering to himself, "You can't investigate what you can't find." Just as he clicked delete all, the door burst open. "Peter!" It was Sophia, breathless, eyes blazing. "Step away from the computer." He froze. "You don't belong in here. And you don't belong in that chair anymore," she shot back, pulling out her phone and recording. "Every file you're deleting is evidence." He lunged toward her, but before he could reach her, Clara appeared behind her, flanked by two members of the security team, men who once took orders from Peter. "Enough," Clara said coldly. "You're done." He stared at her, face red with rage. "You have no idea what you're destroying." "I do," she said. "It's called corruption." By the next morning, the Chronicle updated its story. Operations chief under investigation for evidence tampering. Outside the factory gates, reporters gathered behind barriers. Cameras pointed toward the glass doors of the administrative building, where a podium had been set up. Clara stepped into view. She wasn't dressed in her usual tailored suit, just a dark coat and a gray scarf. The winter wind tangled her hair as she adjusted the microphone. Behind her stood Sophia, several line workers, and Malcolm, steady, silent, in his security jacket once more. She waited for the murmurs to fade, then began. "I know what you've all read," she said, "and I know what you've heard, but I'm not here to control the story. I'm here to tell the truth." She glanced back briefly at Malcolm. His eyes met hers, calm and unwavering. "For too long, this company valued image over integrity," she continued. "We were told to stay quiet, to protect our reputation, to keep the machines running even when people were getting hurt. That ends now." Cameras clicked. A gust of wind rattled the microphone stand. "We've cooperated fully with the Department of Labor. We've turned over every file, every log, every testimony, because North Shore Marine Works will no longer operate in the shadows." She paused, letting her words breathe. "We choose truth over image, people over profit, and accountability over fear." The crowd went silent. Even the hum of the distant cranes seemed to fade. Clara exhaled, steady but tired. "If there are consequences, we'll face them, but we'll face them together." Behind her, Malcolm's posture straightened slightly. His hands rested at his sides, not clenched, not defensive, just still, like a man who'd finally laid down a weight he'd carried for years. The flash of cameras reflected off his jacket, catching the faint silver of his name tag, M. Davis. To the watching world, he looked like an ordinary man in a sea of headlines. But to the people who had worked beside him, he was proof that decency wasn't weakness and courage didn't need a podium. That night, the broadcast replayed the press conference across every major network in Atlantic Canada. One anchor closed the segment with quiet reverence. Tonight, a security guard and a CEO stood side by side and reminded us that truth isn't a luxury. It's a duty. At home, Malcolm turned off the television. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the radiator. He walked to the window, looking out at the harbor lights stretching into the dark. Behind him, Noah's voice came sleepy and soft. "Dad, are you going to be okay?" Malcolm turned and smiled. "Yeah, son. I think this time we're all going to be okay." And outside, beyond the flickering skyline of Halifax, a new kind of light began to spread, not the cold glow of industry, but the warm, steady burn of truth finally seen. The snow that had once seemed soft now fell like ash, cold, relentless, and heavy with meaning. In Halifax, winter had taken hold, and so had the storm around North Shore Marine Works. It began with a lawsuit. The corporate parent, North Shore Holdings International, filed against Clara Jennings personally. The claim: gross negligence and defamation resulting in brand damage. The words themselves were sterile, legal, but everyone knew what it meant. They were coming for her. Within hours, the news broke across financial channels. Commentators debated it like sport. Some called Clara a reckless reformer, others a necessary force of change. Stock prices trembled, investors panicked, and somewhere behind the glass towers of Toronto's financial district, men in suits toasted to her downfall. But Clara didn't flinch. She stood in her office watching the snow sweep past the window, phone buzzing nonstop. Her lawyers pleaded for a statement. PR warned her to lay low, but all she said was, "If the truth hurts the brand, then maybe the brand needs to hurt." Across town, Malcolm noticed the changes immediately. The same black sedan appeared outside his building 3 nights in a row. Once he saw a man step out, light a cigarette, and linger just long enough to be noticed. He didn't tell anyone, not Clara, not Sophia, just filed it away in that quiet place inside him where fear went to die. But the real blow came one morning as he walked Noah to school. The air was crisp, sky the color of pewter. They turned the corner toward the apartment lot, and there it was. The words sprayed across the wall in harsh red paint. "Traitor." Noah froze, his small hand tightening around his father's. "Dad," he whispered. Malcolm looked at the letters, uneven, dripping. fresh. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed, knelt, and looked his son in the eye. "Go ahead inside, bud. I'll take care of it." But Noah didn't move. "Why'd they call you that?" "Because some people think telling the truth is betrayal." "Is it?" Malcolm paused, snowflakes melting on his eyelashes. "Only to those who build their power on lies." Later that night, after Noah went to bed, Malcolm stood outside with a bucket of soapy water and a rag. The red paint bled slowly under his scrubbing, smearing into faint pink streaks. When he was done, his hands were raw, but the wall was clean again, at least on the surface. The following evening, Noah sat beside him on the couch, sketching in silence. Finally, he asked the question Malcolm knew would come. "Dad, do you regret it?" Malcolm looked at the boy's serious face, the pencil smudges on his fingers. "Regret what?" "Telling the truth, getting in trouble, losing your job." Malcolm leaned back, exhaling. "No. You only regret things you stay silent about, not the ones you stand up for." Noah nodded slowly, processing it, then whispered, "Then I don't regret you either." Malcolm smiled, the kind of smile that carried both pain and pride. "Good, because neither do I." Meanwhile, in the dim light of her apartment, Sophia Tran scrolled through lines of code and emails archived deep within the company's old server. She'd been digging for weeks, following breadcrumbs through encrypted folders and mirrored backups. Every click felt like crossing a line, but she couldn't stop. Not after what they'd done to Malcolm. And then, sometime past midnight, she found it. A thread of emails between Peter Lang and a man named Victor Moreau, a subcontractor for the plant's safety. Inspection unit. The subject line read, Priority Certification, Issue 4. The first message was short. Ensure compliance reports are filed on schedule. Compensation for discretion as discussed. Attached below, a transfer receipt. $5,000 labeled as consulting fee. Another email followed. Payment received. Inspections passed. No anomalies detected. Sophia stared at the screen. Her heart pounded. This wasn't just negligence. It was bribery, a chain of proof. She printed everything, sealed the pages in a folder, and called Clara. "Are you sitting down?" she asked. "I've been standing for days," Clara replied wearily. "What did you find?" "Lang and the contractors. They bribed the safety inspectors. There's a paper trail." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Sophia to hear her own heartbeat. "Send it to me," Clara said finally, "and back it up somewhere safe. If this is what I think it is, it could take down the whole upper tier." The next morning, Malcolm got the call. "Malcolm, it's Clara." Her voice was tired, frayed, but steady. "Sophia found something big. This is the proof we've been waiting for. The kind no lawyer can spin, no executive can bury." Malcolm listened quietly, watching the morning light spill through the window onto Noah's half-built Lego set. "Then we're close," he said. Closer than ever. He could hear her take a breath on the other end, the kind of breath you take before walking into fire. "Clara," he said softly, "you know what they'll do now, right?" "I know." "Then don't do it alone." There was a pause, then a faint, grateful laugh. "I wouldn't dream of it." That night, Clara met Sophia and Malcolm in the old maintenance shed, the place where the vault had been born. The air inside was colder than before, their breath visible in small clouds. Sophia placed the printed emails on the table, sliding them across like sacred documents. "This is it," she said. "Proof of bribery, falsified inspections, and financial transactions linking Lang directly to the contractors." Clara flipped through the pages, her hands trembling slightly. "This could turn everything." Malcolm crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. "Or burn it all down." Clara looked up. "Maybe it has to." For a moment, the three of them stood in silence. Outside, snow fell heavier, tapping against the tin roof like distant footsteps. Finally, Malcolm broke the quiet. "If they come after us again, they'll hit harder this time." "I know," Clara said. "But this time, we'll hit back. Not with noise, but with light." And as she said it, Sophia turned off the computer's sleep mode, revealing the vault's encrypted folder glowing faintly on the screen. Its name shimmered in white against the dark. Truth Backup Final. Malcolm looked at it for a long time, then nodded slowly. Let them come. Outside, the storm thickened, but inside the shed, under the hum of a single flickering bulb, 3 people who had once been strangers now stood together like a single pulse against the cold. And this time, they weren't hiding the truth. They were preparing to release it. The morning of the reckoning dawned cold and still. Halifax Harbor was a sheet of pale steel, the cranes frozen against a sky the color of pewter. By 9 a.m., the parking lot of North Shore Marine Works was overflowing. Cameras, news vans, and a crowd that stretched down the street. Workers, families, reporters, union representatives, all drawn by a single rumor. Something was about to break. A platform had been set up outside the main gates, its edges dusted with frost. A banner behind it bore the company's name, but someone in the crowd had hung a handmade sign over it in bold red letters. Truth Works Here. Clara Jennings stood behind the curtain, gloved hands clenched around her notes. She had faced boardrooms, judges, and shareholders, but this felt different, heavier, final. Next to her, Malcolm adjusted the collar of his jacket, the same one he'd worn the night everything began. The patch on his sleeve, North Shore's security, it was frayed now, but it looked more like a badge of honor than a uniform. "You ready?" Clara asked quietly. Malcolm gave a faint smile. "You?" "I'll let you know after it's over." Beyond the curtain, the murmur of the crowd swelled like the sea before a storm, and somewhere, under the hum of cameras and distant seagulls, they could hear the faint wail of approaching sirens. The press conference began at precisely 10. Clara stepped up to the podium, the winter light glinting off the microphone. A hush rippled through the crowd. Reporters lifted their cameras, the red lights blinking like stars. "Good morning," she began, her breath visible in the cold. "For months, this company, our company, has stood at the center of a truth too long buried. Today, that truth stands in the open." She gestured to the files stacked beside her, thick folders marked with the logo of the Department of Labor, Canada. These are the results of the federal investigation, documents, testimonies, and transactions linking former operations head Peter Lang to fraudulent inspections, bribery, and suppression of safety violations. Murmurs broke out, reporters scrambling to capture every word. Clara's voice held steady. "We did not find these by accident. We found them because people refused to stay silent. People who believed integrity was worth more than comfort." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. Workers she had once only known as numbers on a payroll. This isn't just a victory for the company, it's a victory for every person who ever feared speaking up, for every family that lost someone to negligence and was told to move on. Today, we move forward instead. The crowd erupted in applause, muffled by gloves and emotion. From the back of the platform, a commotion stirred. The sirens grew louder. RCMP cruisers pulled up along the curb, lights flashing red and blue across the white snow. 2 federal officers stepped out, their coats crisp, their faces unreadable. Behind them, Peter Lang was led forward, flanked by plainclothes agents. His face was pale, defiant, but broken. The flash of cameras turned him ghostly. The man who once ruled the factory floor, now stumbling across it in handcuffs. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "That's him!" Another voice followed, raw, trembling, furious. "You cost us lives, Peter." And then, from somewhere near the center, a single voice rose above the noise. A woman's voice, strong and trembling all at once. "Justice!" The word echoed, sharp and clear. Then another voice joined, and another. "Justice! Justice!" Until the chant spread like a wave, rolling over the cold air. Not vengeful, but righteous, a sound years overdue. Clara stood frozen for a moment, watching Peter being escorted into the waiting car. The weight of it all pressed into her chest. Relief, sorrow, vindication. She turned toward Malcolm, who stood slightly behind her, arms folded, eyes fixed on the horizon. For a moment, the crowd noise faded. It was just them, the woman who rebuilt truth from ruin, and the man who refused to look away. She stepped back to the microphone. "Before we close," she said, her voice softer now, "I want to acknowledge someone without whom none of this would have been possible." Malcolm lifted his head, startled. She looked directly at him. "Malcolm Davis, you were the first to act when others stood still. You reminded us that strength isn't measured by position or title, but by conscience. You taught me that doing the right thing doesn't make you powerful. It makes you whole." For a long second, the only sound was the click of cameras. Then the crowd began to clap, slowly at first, then building until the air itself seemed to shake. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't bow or smile. He just met Clara's gaze and gave a single steady nod, the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had seen the worst of the system and still chose to stand. Afterward, the press swarmed, the microphones pushed forward, questions shouted through the air. Will there be more arrests? What's next for North Shore? Is this the end or the beginning? But Clara's answer was simple. "This isn't an ending," she said. "It's a reckoning and a reminder that truth doesn't destroy, it rebuilds." Behind her, workers embraced, some crying, some laughing. One older man, a welder with grease still under his nails, reached out to shake Malcolm's hand. "You did it," he said. Malcolm shook his head. "We did." And as the crowd slowly dispersed, the air seemed lighter, warmer somehow, even as snow continued to fall. Later that evening, the footage played on every national broadcast. The image was everywhere. Peter Lang in handcuffs, Clara at the podium, Malcolm standing in the background with calm, unyielding eyes. Commentators called it a turning point in Canadian labor ethics. Activists called it hope made visible. But for those who had been there, for the ones who'd tasted oil and steel, who'd whispered fears into locker rooms, it was something simpler. It was justice. Not the kind written in court documents, but the kind that hums quietly in the chest when wrong finally bends toward right. And as night settled over Halifax, the factory lights glowed softly against the falling snow. Inside the main hall, the machines stood still, silent for the first time in years, as if they too were bowing their heads in respect. And outside, under the vast winter sky, the word still echoed faintly through the cold, "Justice." The weeks after the arrest unfolded like the slow thaw of winter, quiet at first, then suddenly alive with movement. The Department of Labor of Canada issued its final report, and with it, a mandate that would change North Shore Marine Works forever. A full structural reform, mandatory safety audits, independent oversight. No more silence buried under signatures. For years, the factory had been a place where metal screamed louder than men. But now, something new echoed through the halls. Voices, questions, laughter. Clara Jennings stood in the same boardroom where, months earlier, she had been told to keep her head down. The walls had been repainted a softer white, the blinds pulled open to let in sunlight. The air itself felt different. Not lighter exactly, but cleaner. She set a folder on the table marked Post-Reform Implementation. Inside were new policies that would ripple far beyond the plant. An anonymous employee hotline for reporting safety violations, hazard pay and wage increases for night shift workers, and a new initiative she'd named the Safe Hands Foundation, a fund for workers injured on the job and their families. When the press asked why she created it, Clara's answer was simple: because no one should have to choose between feeding their family and staying alive. Down on the factory floor, welders worked beside new air filters, and the clang of steel rang less like chaos, more like rhythm. The smell of oil still hung in the air, but it carried something else now: dignity. Malcolm walked through the corridor in a new uniform, the company's redesigned patch stitched onto his sleeve, Chief of Site Integrity and Community Safety. It was an official title, but it didn't change him. He still carried his thermos of black coffee, still made his rounds in the quiet hours when the world forgot the night crew existed. One of the new hires, a young man fresh out of trade school, stopped him near the loading bay. "Sir, they say you're the one who started all this. The reason we got these reforms." Malcolm smiled faintly. "I didn't start it," he said. "I just stopped pretending I couldn't see it." When the local news station called, asking him to appear on a televised segment titled Heroes of Halifax, Malcolm declined. "I'm not a hero," he told them. "I just want people to get home without someone else's blood on their hands." They printed the quote anyway. It ran the next day beneath a photograph of him standing outside the plant gates, hands in his jacket pockets, snow falling like soft ash around him. The headline read, "The Man Who Watched and Chose to Act." Clara, meanwhile, kept her focus on the work. She refused magazine interviews and conference invitations, choosing instead to walk the floor each morning. Sometimes she'd bring coffee for the welders. Sometimes she'd stop to listen to an idea or complaint. "Do you ever rest?" Sophia teased one afternoon, watching her pore over reports. Clara smiled. "Rest isn't the goal, trust is." The friendship between her, Malcolm, and Sophia endured, not the loud kind built on victory, but the quiet kind forged in battle. They met once a week in the old maintenance shed that had once housed the vault. It had been cleaned, repainted, and fitted with new lights, but the table remained the same, its wood still scarred by the weight of their truth. On one wall, Malcolm had taped a single photo, a paper boat floating in a bowl of water, its folds crisp and careful. When Sophia asked about it, he only said, "A reminder, truth floats, no matter how deep it sinks." At home, life began to resemble peace again. Noah's laughter returned first, in the mornings before school, when the smell of pancakes filled the kitchen and sunlight hit the chipped window frame just right. The boy was older now, quieter in thought, but brighter in presence. He'd been through the storm too in his own way. One evening, Malcolm found him at the table, scribbling furiously in a notebook. "Homework?" he asked. "Kind of," Noah said. "We have to do a presentation about someone we admire." Malcolm smiled. "Who'd you pick?" Noah grinned. "You'll see." A week later, the classroom buzzed with chatter as students shuffled index cards and rehearsed lines about athletes, inventors, and superheroes. When Noah's turn came, he walked to the front, straight-backed but nervous. He placed a single photo on the projector, his father standing outside the plant in his uniform, half smiling, half tired, with the harbor wind in his coat. "My dad's not famous," Noah began. "He doesn't wear a cape or own a company. He just listens." The class fell silent. "He listens when people are scared to talk, when they think no one cares. And sometimes," Noah continued, voice steady now, "that's all it takes to change everything." His teacher wiped her eyes. The students clapped, hesitant at first, then warm and long. That evening, Malcolm came home to find Noah's presentation folder sitting open on the counter. He flipped through the pages, photos of the factory, a drawing of a man standing in the rain, a small quote written in Noah's handwriting. "Courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's just someone who refuses to look away." Malcolm closed the folder slowly, his chest tightening with quiet pride. He stepped out onto the balcony. Halifax Harbor shimmered in the distance, the lights reflecting like constellations on the dark water. Below, the hum of the city moved steady and calm, ships loading, horns sounding, life continuing. For a long moment, he simply stood there, breathing in the cold. The world hadn't become perfect. It probably never would. But it had become honest. And for Malcolm Davis, a father, a worker, a man who once knelt beside a fallen woman and refused to look away, that was enough. Inside, Noah's laughter echoed again, and Malcolm smiled, a real smile this time, as he whispered into the wind, "Go home safe, everyone." The wind carried his words away, across the harbor, through the gates of the factory, where the machines hummed again, not just with work, but with life. The factory breathed again. Months after the reckoning, the furnaces burned steady, the machines sang in rhythm, and the echo that once sounded like exhaustion had turned into something closer to music. Laughter cut through the clang of metal, mixing with the hiss of steam and the hum of renewed life. The place that had once felt haunted by silence now pulsed with warmth and purpose. Clara walked along the main corridor, a yellow hard hat perched over her hair, clipboard tucked beneath her arm. Malcolm followed a few steps behind, his boots echoing against the newly polished floor. Workers waved as they passed, not out of formality, but recognition. "Morning, boss," one called. "Morning, Dave," Clara replied. "How's the new ventilation line?" "Like breathing fresh air for the first time," he said, grinning. Malcolm smiled quietly. He didn't say much on these walks. He didn't have to. They moved through the plant together, inspecting the new safety barriers, the warning lights, the break room lined with photographs of workers who'd helped rebuild it all. A mural stretched across the far wall, a ship breaking through waves beneath the words, "Integrity keeps us standing." Clara stopped to admire it. "Who came up with that?" Malcolm shrugged. "I think you did. You just never said it out loud." She glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "And you're the one who made it true." Later that afternoon, the sun slipped low over Halifax, scattering golden light through the high factory windows. Dust and steam caught the glow, refracting into a faint rainbow that shimmered across the steel walls. Malcolm stood near the entrance, wiping down the old brass nameplate that had hung there for decades. The letters, once proud, now tarnished, still read, "North Shore Marine Works." He traced the rusted edge with his thumb, then loosened the bolts with a wrench. The sign came free with a reluctant groan. For a long moment, he held it in his hands, heavy with history and sweat. Then he leaned it gently against the wall. Beside him, a new plate waited, smaller, cleaner, engraved in quiet silver letters. "Integrity keeps us standing." He lifted it into place, tightened each bolt carefully, then stepped back. The light caught on the polished surface, the reflection breaking into soft color, gold, blue, green, a rainbow stretching across the entryway. Clara joined him there, her coat draped over one arm. "Looks better than the old one." "Maybe," he said, "but it's not just for show." She looked up at the sign, her eyes tracing the words. "No, it's not." They stood side by side as the sun poured through the windows, painting the walls in shifting color. Neither spoke. There was no need. The silence between them wasn't distance anymore. It was understanding, rich and wordless. Malcolm looked down at her, the corners of his eyes creasing. "You ever think we'd make it here?" Clara smiled faintly. "Not once, but I kept hoping someone did." He chuckled softly, turning his gaze back to the floor, to the place where oil stains had once marked the spot of an old accident, now scrubbed clean. "You know," he said after a moment, "hope's a lot like steel. It bends before it breaks." "And when it breaks?" she asked. He glanced at her, his voice low. "You melt it down and start again." Outside, the siren marked the end of the shift. Workers streamed out through the gates, laughing, shoulders brushing, hard hats tilted back under the late sun. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried above the harbor. Claire and Malcolm lingered a while longer, watching them go. The people who had once been invisible, now walking taller, brighter, freer. When she finally turned to leave, he stayed a step behind, as he always had. Not out of rank, but respect. And for the first time since it all began, the factory didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a promise kept. A year later, winter returned to Halifax, the kind that quieted streets and softened the edges of everything it touched. Snow fell gently outside the community center, where the Safe Hands Foundation was holding its first anniversary event. Inside, the room glowed with warmth, coffee urns steaming, old workers in their Sunday jackets, children running between tables decorated with paper boats. At the front, a small banner read, "Safe Hands, for those who build our tomorrow." Clara stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady but tender. 1 year ago, this foundation began with a simple idea that every worker deserves to come home whole. Today, we've awarded over 30 scholarships to children of our North Shore families. Tonight, we celebrate their courage and their future. Applause filled the hall. Cameras flashed, but this time, no one posed. They simply clapped for one another. Among the crowd, Noah moved shyly toward the stage, a small bouquet of winter flowers in his hands. He reached Claire and handed them up with a grin. "These are from my dad," he said. Clara laughed, eyes softening as she accepted them. "Tell him he should have delivered them himself." "He said you'd say that," Noah replied. "He said to tell you he's better at fixing bolts than talking into microphones." The room chuckled warmly. Clara bent down, brushing a strand of hair from the boy's forehead. "You tell him he's wrong about that." Later that night, back at home, Malcolm sat by the small desk near his window, reading a letter that had arrived earlier that day. The envelope bore the seal of the Department of Labor. He unfolded it carefully. "Dear Mr. Davis, in recognition of your contributions to the advancement of workplace integrity and safety culture across Canada, the department extends its gratitude. Your actions have inspired reform and restored trust where it was once broken. With respect and thanks, the Minister of Labor." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the paper resting against his chest. He didn't smile exactly, but the lines around his eyes deepened in quiet peace. On the shelf beside him sat Noah's drawing from his school project, "My Dad's the Man Who Listens," now framed in simple wood. Beneath it, the paper boat still floated inside a glass bowl, its edges yellowed but intact. He looked at them both for a while, then stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped out into the night. The harbor was silent under a thin veil of snow. Lights from the docks shimmered across the dark water, stretching into gold and blue lines that rippled with the tide. Malcolm walked to the railing, the cold wind tugging at his coat. He could hear the faint hum of the city, distant, steady, alive. He took a slow breath and let it out. The years of noise and fear, the weight of everything unsaid, all of it seemed to dissolve into the salt air. Somewhere far out in the bay, a ship's horn sounded, low, mournful, and beautiful. Malcolm watched the reflection of the lights shiver across the water, and for a moment it looked almost like fire dancing beneath the surface. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Justice isn't loud. It stands watch in silence and wakes whenever someone dares to speak the truth." The wind carried his words out across the harbor, over the water, past the factory that now glowed with its new sign and steady lights. And for the first time, the night didn't feel cold. It felt awake.